colonial criticism, I would like to quickly tell you a little bit about theory. Now, guys, we know that theory is basically any set of assumptions that we make, and it is a set of tentative assumptions. Okay, so theory is basically, we can say, a set of tentative assumptions related to a political cause. Theory is completely related to a political assumptions. We can say that theory is completely political in that sense. Unlike criticism, we see that criticism is basically a text based approach where a writer tries to um, analyze a text, literary text, but theory is completely an idea based approach. Okay, and it is politically oriented. Most importantly, theory is interdisciplinary in nature. Any theory which we use is interdisciplinary in nature. So in that context, it's very important that whenever we use the word theory, we must understand that it is interdisciplinary in nature. When we talk about post-colonial theory, the central idea is the conflict between the interest of colonizers and colonized. Okay, so colonizer or colonized के interest, colonizers एंड colonized, colonizer और colonized जो लोग हैं उनके बीच के जो इंटरेस्ट हैं उनको अगर हम देखें, उसको conflict हम कहें तो कोई, it will not be a wrong assumption, where we see the colonizers were the imperial people who colonized the places like India, and colonized were the people who were living there. So post-colonial theory looks at the essential conflict between colonizers and colonized, right? So let's move on to the major post-colonial theorist. This PDF is taken from the critical approaches of M.A.R.Habib. Okay, so you can refer to this book as a very important literary text. So this is the history of English literary criticism by M.A.R.Habib sir, and I have taken the PDF from there, and we are going to explain it here. So post-colonial criticism is political approach to interpretation gathered intensity in the 1980s. It is concerned with the economic, cultural, and psychological effect of imperialism and emancipation from colonial rule, right? So, post-colonial criticism is basically dealing with the economic, cultural, and psychological impacts of imperialism. So, these three words we can underline, very important. Okay, and also emancipation means freedom. Freedom from how the freedom was achieved, it is related to that. Okay, since post-colonial theory is rooted in the theory in the history of imperialism, it is worth looking at this history. In my earlier lecture, guys, I have already explained you the three phases of colonialism that basically were given. So it is like between just a quick revision from 1492 to mid 18th century. We see that these empires and colonies were invaded, and these were the countries which invaded the colonies like Spain, Portugal, England, France, and Netherlands, right? Then between the second phase is from mid 18th century till the First World War, including the First World War. So there it was a scramble for imperialistic power between Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and other nations. So you can see the faces have changed, and here you can see it is called as the mad scramble for power. This is the second phase of colonialism, and the third phase is, you can say, the here it is described the second phase in detail. That is the end of the 17th century, sorry, 19th century. More than one-fifth of the land area and the quarter of its population had been brought under British Empire. So we know, guys, what we call as India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Burma, and Sudan. All these countries, they can be broadly called under post-colonial post-colonialism, or we can say the post-colonial countries. Uh, Most of the literature that have emerged or that has emerged is from these countries, and these were earlier termed as Commonwealth nation, but now the word is ill-suited for that, and now we don't use this word Commonwealth. Commonwealth referred to those countries which were once the part of the mighty British Empire. So the word, in a way, connoted. connotes the, you know, the colonialism. So that's why we don't use the word Commonwealth. We use the third world literature. In fact, in my last lecture, I told you that even the third world word is now avoided. We use the word tricontinental literature. Please note it down as a very important question, tricontinental literature. In fact, this is the name of the journal that, kind of launched in a modern inquiry into post-colonialism. Okay, so here we are in the first and second phase. So it's all defined here. The third phase of colonialism is, of course, we can say the phase when, you know, the periods during and after World War II, it saw a struggle involving both the countries just mentioned, as well as a conflict between America and Communist Soviet Union for extended control, power, and influence. Needless to say, these imperialistic endeavors survived into present day in altered forms and with new antagonists. प्लीज यहाँ पर नोट करेंगे, इट्स वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग. जो conflict between America and Soviet Union is hinted, it's actually referring to the era of Cold War. Very important in terms of post-colonial studies. What is the Cold War? The era of Cold War, it is actually a period when we say the countries of these two nations, they started, you know um, developing their nuclear arsenals, and with the passage of time we see that more and more nuclear armory was developed, and eventually we see that the war did not happen, but it in a way um, led to a huge terror among the nations. Okay, so that is there. uh, Guys, we can see that after the three phases, we are seeing here the major publications which occurred in the initial phases of post-colonialism. And here we can see the one of the most important text was, of course, some of the seminal texts were M.A. Cizer's Discourse sur de Colonialism, Friends, Finance, Black Skin, White Mask, and in 58, Chinua Achebe published his very important Things Fall Apart. Now, this novel, Things Fall Apart, actually falls under a trilogy called as TNA. This is a code for you to remember. It's a trilogy. The first is Things Fall Apart, which came in the year 1958. Now, for from N, we can say No Longer at Ease. No Longer at Ease is actually the second novel of this trilogy, and the third is Arrow of God. So you can say these are the three novels which come under this very famous trilogy. The first novel, Things Fall Apart, is taken from the very famous poem The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. Right. You can say that the Robert Young founding moment of post-colonial theory was the tricontinental, which appeared in 1966, is the first global alliance, as I said in my last lecture. And Edward Said's Orientalism appeared in 1978. It is called as the Manifesto of Post-Colonialism. I told you also about the Holy Trinity, which included E, G, and E for Edward Said, G for Gayatri Spivak, and of course H for Homi K. Bhabha, EGH. In whichever way you want to learn this code. Okay, out of the three, two are, of course, Indians, these two, and he is a Palestinian scholar, right? So here you can see the basic fundamental aim of post-colonial criticism is to re-examine the history of colonialism from the perspective of the colonized. This is the first aim. That is, we re-challenge the history as given to us by the colonial powers, and we try to understand it from the perspective of colonized. The second purpose is to determine the economic, political, and cultural impact of colonialism on both the colonized people and colonizing power. This is the second thing. Third is to analyze the process of decolonization. Now, this is very important, guys. Now, here I am giving you a question. The process decolonization, the term was given by Gugi wa Thiong'o, a very important African critic, as well as a writer who wrote the works like Bloods of Petal, Weep Not Child. These were some important works by Gugi wa Thiong'o, right? So, and above all, to participate in the goals of this is the last aim, political liberation, which includes equal access to material resources, contestation of forms of domination, and articulation of political and cultural identities, right? So, these are the three or four major aims of post-colonialism. Now let's look at some of the important thinkers of post-colonialism. The most important thinker is Edward Said, whose lifespan is from 1935 to 2004. He is known as a literary and cultural theorist. He was a Palestinian, very important, who taught at various institutions in US. His thinking has embraced three imperatives. Number one, to articulate the cultural position and task of the intellectual and literary critic, to examine the historical production and motivation of Western discourses about the Orient in general and Islam in particular. Now, this word Orient is very important. He has given us two words, Orient and Occident. Now, please note it as very important. Orient or Orientalism refers to the Eastern philosophy or the culture from the East, right? And Occidental represents anything that is Western. In a way, Western people have shown themselves as superior, or they can say that they have shown themselves as highly intellectual, and they have shown Orient as primitive, or you can say anything that is not in a way educated sense. Okay, so attempt the to bring to light and clarify the Palestinian struggle to regain a homeland, right? So Occidental, Oriental, I have cleared. Now, in Orientalism, he examines the vast tradition of Western construction of the Orient. This is very important. This tradition of Orientalism has been a corporate institution. Please mark this word, for coming to terms with the Orient, for authorizing views about it and ruling over it. So, in a way, he is saying that the Western people have shown themselves as intellectually superior, and it's a kind of authorization of their views that they have given through Orientalism. It's a kind of indirect rule over the colonized. He said that the Orient is actually a production. Please mark it as very important, all the net students. It's a production of Western discourse, a means of self-definition of Western culture, as well as of justifying imperial domination of Oriental people. His aim is not to show that this politically edifice of language somehow distort a real Orient, but he's rather to show that it is indeed a language with an internal consistency, motivation, and capacity for representation, resting on a relationship of power and hegemony over the Orient. Very important, guys. What is he trying to say? Let's see. So, that he is trying to show that very importantly that actually the language देखो दो चीजें there are two things कि language distorts the orient or distort. So the first possibility he rejects. He says that no, language has not distorted the Orient's stereotypes, but it is in fact an intentional act. Please mark this word as very important. It's an intentional act of internal consistency, motivation, and capacity of representation, resting on a relationship of power and hegemony. So, what is he trying to say is that this representation of Orient as something that is inferior, something that is of lesser value is intentional, and it rests on the relationship between power and hegemony. Now, if you remember, hegemony, a very important term given by Italian prisoner Antonio Gramsci. If you remember the word Antonio Gramsci, okay, and his work Prison Notebooks, very important work. Okay, so I hope all of us are getting my point, that he is trying to show in this very important work that the Orientalism is a intentional act of construction, motivation, and it is completely, uh, you can say, represented in a biased way by those who were in power and hegemony. Of course, he is representing to the colonizers. Very interesting. So then, further, in this book, it is mentioned that it is also an attempt to display Orientalism as complex example of politically and ideologically rooted nature of all discourse. Thus, liberal cultural heroes. So the so-called liberal cultural heroes, that means those were liberal, those were in favor of liberty for all, like Mill, Arnold, and Carlyle. All views were overlooked. Their views on race and imperialism were overlooked. Very interesting. So that means in Orientalism, there was this intentional overlooking of the so-called liberal cultural heroes, because they were not of use of colonizers. That's why they looked, or they overlooked, they ignored the views of these people, because these people gave the views on race and imperialism which were very important and which could have reacted against the colonizers. So colonizers, in a very complex and a very politically ideologically motivated manner, completely discarded, ignored these views of such heroes, using a vast range of example. Now these examples are important, like SHLS, okay, play the Persians, then Macaulay, Renan, and Marx. To all these examples, he attempted to examine the stereotypes. These were the stereotypes created by the colonizers and distortions through which Islam and East have been consumed, that means represented. These stereotypes include Islam as a heretical imitation of Christianity, exotic sexuality of Oriental women. Now, this point is very important, guys, that they represented Orientalism as an exotic sexuality. The Islam as a culture incapable of innovation. It is represented as a primitive culture. Very important, guys. Okay, he suggests that the electronic postmodern world reinforces, इन चीजों को और ज्यादा reinforce करता है, dehumanized portrayals of the Arabs. जो अरब्स हैं उनको डीह्यूमनाइज्ड पोर्ट्रेज के तौर पर दिखाया गया है, खासकर इलेक्ट्रॉनिक पोस्ट मॉडर्न वर्ल्ड में. अ टेंडेंसी एग्रेवेटेड बाय अरब इजरायली कॉन्फ्लिक्ट एंड इंटेंशनली felt by Said himself as a Palestinian. Very important, guys. So this is it, a short analysis on postcolonialism lecture 2. Please do join me on this short series of postcolonialism, where I am going to look at the next theorist, Henry Louis Gates Jr., in my next lecture. Till that time, keep studying postcolonialism, and also please do posting your reviews on how you are liking this lecture and what are the things that we can further study. Thank you.